Cutler. Podium?
I don't care, wherever you look for it.
There we go.
Oh. Hello? Hi. I tried to get here early so we could have more than 30 minutes. So we got 35. Now, how do you want to proceed?
Well, I have a stack of questions
Okay,
to ask you. I thought maybe you would want to do a little bit of
I would.
introductory statement.
I would.
Okay.
First of all, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I don't know how many of you know my friend Eric Hughes. I met Eric 2 or 3 years ago when I gave the graduation speech at Strive U in Portland. And Eric was a graduate. And his pizza business in Portland on Commercial Street, his Pizza Cart, has won the Portland Press Herald Award for the best food cart in Portland 2 years in a row. And I've had a lot of conversations with Eric and with others at Strive U over the years. And what I want to say about Eric and about every one of us who lives in Maine is that Eric says, I want my own life. I want my own place to live. I want a job. I want a pet. I want a boyfriend or a girlfriend. I want to be married, and I want to be independent. And Teddy Roosevelt once said something in his Square Deal speech, which was the defining moment for Roosevelt. Because Roosevelt was very much an independent. He was an independent Republican, and then he became a bull mooser. But Roosevelt believed deeply in what he called and what he wrote in his Square Deal speech, in a substantial equality of opportunity for every single person living in America. It was Roosevelt's understanding that the philosophy of a substantial equality of opportunity didn't mean that everyone in America should be guaranteed success, but rather that everyone in America should have a fair shot, a real chance, a substantially equal opportunity. I have tried in my 2 careers in public life and in my work in the private sector to live a life committed to that notion, that idea, that ideal, because I believe in it deeply, to the bottom of my soul. I believe in substantial equality of opportunity, and it has seemed to me that from your point of view and from mine, that should be the measure, the criterion for government policy in the state of Maine. So let's stop with that. That's long enough. I probably used up my extra, no I didn't, not quite, my extra time. So Kim, let's start with your questions.
Okay.
Thank you again for having me.
And thank you for being here. Oh, I need glasses. That's right. It's 2014. I need glasses now.
Right. Getting old.
Yes, all right. Number 1.
Sorry
Being
about
treated with dignity and respect is very important to people with disabilities. Decisions are often made about us without us. How would you actively reach out to people with disabilities to ensure that governmental decision-making processes include people with disabilities? Similarly, what would you do to make sure that qualified people with disabilities are part of your staff?
First of all, I think that a governor leads in two ways. The governor leads with policies and with budgets and with ideas. But a governor also leads by example. Because people pay attention to what a governor does, what he is, he or she, what he or she thinks. And you demonstrate that by what you do and who's with you. And I will tell you right now, and I've made this pledge over and over in this campaign, that we will have a diverse staff and we will have a diverse workforce in state government. And that doesn't mean just men and women. It doesn't mean just people of color. It also means people with disabilities. My wife is a child psychiatrist. I understand, I think, from her, from my own experience in my own family, where my nephew, a very close nephew.
Here.
You sure? Yeah. Was developmentally disabled. John Nutting, Senator John Nutting from Leeds, who is a member of my staff, has a developmentally disabled, psychiatrically cared for son. Adam Zimmerman, who is a visually impaired lawyer and a fabulous lawyer, has been on my staff, was on my staff in the 2010 campaign. He's now practicing law both in Massachusetts and in Maine and doing very well. And I've told him that if I'm elected, I want his help in Augusta. So number one, I can make and believe in a pledge of diversity because I believe the example set by a governor is terribly important. Number two, I want to make sure that we fully implement the LePage main span plan, not just with video and audio access, but also captioning for hearing impaired and deaf. I want to make sure that every single disabled person in the state of Maine can access the workings of state government, hearings in the legislature, important events in Augusta. That's something that we ought to be able to do. And finally, and I think many of you know this, I will always be available, whether it's to the DRC, whether it's to SUFU, whether it's to NAMI, Sweetser, Goodwill, anybody, I will always be available. I'm a very lucky guy. I only need about 4 or 5 hours of sleep a night. And so I have long days, and I use every single minute to inform myself. And that's the important point about having an open door availability for all of you.
Okay. I don't want to waste it. I don't want to waste any of his minutes, but do you want to put that in here? You don't have to hold it? There.
Does it work?
Yeah. Can everybody hear? All right. That one's better.
Here, come up here.
No, this is working. I made a really good joke. I said, can everybody hear? And the deaf community said no.
I could have told you that.
Yeah. Number two, in Maine and nationally, the employment rate of people with disabilities is about half that of people without disabilities. People with disabilities seeking employment still face discrimination and the denial of work opportunities that might lift them out of poverty. What steps would you take to improve employment opportunities for people with disabilities in Maine? What can Maine government do to hire and retain qualified workers with disabilities? Can the state be the model employer? It's currently legal. This is a multi-part question because there were so many employment questions. It is currently legal to pay people with disabilities as little as 22 cents per hour. There are lots of people in Maine that still make that sub-minimum wage. And there are lots of us that would like to see that gone. If elected, would you support efforts to eliminate sub-minimum wage?
Absolutely. We ought to be ashamed of ourselves. We ought to be ashamed of ourselves. A job is a job. A job is a job, and you ought to get real pay for real work. Period. I will lead the fight to get rid of sub-minimum wage. The very term sub-minimum wage is an insult. Let's just get rid of it, number one. Number two, we don't do very well in Maine. We have a higher proportion of people in our population with disabilities than the national average, and we have a very low rate of participation in the workforce. How do you change that? Well, first of all, we ought to be able to get our workforce growing, and we ought to be able to reach the goal of roughly 50% by 2020. It's about halfway between North Dakota and the national average, and North Dakota's doing pretty well. How are we going to do that? Well, remember what I said a few minutes ago. First of all, we, the governor and the governor's administration, can be a model. You know, the federal government has said 7% is the right number. Well, let's start with that. Let's see if we could do that in the state of Maine. Let's have that as our goal. There's absolutely no reason why we shouldn't be able to achieve it if we put our minds to it. And by modeling that kind of behavior for the private sector, we can bring the private sector along. There are a lot of leadership models in the private sector. Walgreens, Tam Brands, the Procter & Gamble subsidiary in Lewiston, Auburn. There are others. But the governor's role is to lead the way, not to wait, not to talk, not to convene meetings, not to have summits, but to lead the way and to lead by example. We ought to be, we really should be ashamed of ourselves right now. And I promise you, I'm committed to fixing that and getting rid of a sub-minimum wage.
All right, thank you. Number 3, people living below the poverty level are not eligible for health insurance subsidies in the new marketplace. Many Mainers with incomes just above the poverty level who are eligible for subsidies will find premiums and out-of-pocket costs too expensive. Would you support accepting federal funds to increase access to health care coverage through Maine's Medicaid program?
You don't have to finish.
Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, but the rest of the question, I think, was, and if not, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
We're not going to get to the if not. Yes, of course we're going to accept the federal funds for Medicaid expansion. And not only in order to cover the 70,000 people who don't have access to primary and secondary preventive care in a medical home. That's really important. But the other point that is important, I think, to make about Medicaid and MaineCare is that it pays for a lot of services that the disabled need that you can never find in private insurance plans, even if the insurance is available and even if you can afford it. That by itself is a reason to take the Medicaid money. When we take the Medicaid money, we're not only doing something for you and for the other folks who need to who need the access, we're doing something for the state of Maine. We're doing something for the taxpayers who are otherwise covered. Because right now we are losing our shirts in the state of Maine on health care. We have the 5th highest per capita costs in the country. And the hospitals whose debt the governor paid off by selling the liquor business, the hospitals are now all the way back into the red or on their way there right now because of the governor's determination not to accept Medicaid expansion funding. Well, what are you going to do next? What are you going to sell next? The Maine Turnpike? I mean, this is crazy. This is really crazy. Now, expanding Medicaid is only the first step. Maine is one of the few states in America that does not have a health care system plan. We don't have a plan. We're about to have in Maine 2 and only 2 health care systems. 2. Now, this is an opportunity and it's also a challenge because there's not going to be as much competition as we might like with 2 systems. But 2 systems also gives us the opportunity to work together to put in place a healthcare system plan in Maine that addresses the needs of all 1,300,000 of us, period. Third, when we develop that plan, I promise you, because even if I didn't want to do this on my own, my wife would divorce me after 40 years if I didn't do it. We need to integrate mental health care with the rest of health care in the state of Maine. And I guess the final point I want to make about health care in Maine is that there are even more reasons than the ones I've just mentioned to work with the federal government. The hidden benefit of the Affordable Care Act, beyond the expansion of Medicaid coverage, is that the Affordable Care Act really permits and even encourages states to put in place a health care system plan that matches that particular state's needs. There are all kinds of programs now, including the Balancing Incentive Program, the Money Follows the Person Program, ways to coordinate care for dual eligibles, on and on and on, the Community First Choice option. These are all parts of the efforts that the federal government will make with states that step up to the plate and say, yes, we're going to do the job. But when you have a governor who says, no, I don't want your help, no, I don't want your money, and I don't care what the federal government's policies are, we're constraining ourselves. We're tying our own hands behind our back. We're not making available to us the kinds of opportunities that the federal government will help make available for us. We're going to change this, and we're going to change it beginning when I'm inaugurated on January 5.
All right, thank you.
Sorry, you don't have to. Let's not take up valuable time that I can use talking to this.
One more interruption, though. I, as recently as 2 years ago, standing up here doing this, I could see that clock, and I cannot. So I'm going to have to ask Peter or Rick to raise your hand or something when it's 2 o'clock.
17 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Will you do that? All right, thanks. Number 4, people with disabilities and advocates for people with disabilities and a lot of other people are frustrated that after 24 and a half years, the ADA was passed 24 and a half years ago, public buildings are still being approved and built, shockingly, that are not accessible. In fact, there's a brand spanking new fancy hotel, I won't mention the name of it, at the southern end of Commercial Street that has 3 big steps to get into it. Yep. So at least Alpha 1 and the Disability Rights Center are very, very surprised by that. How would you propose to ensure that businesses make their facilities accessible? And would you support a system of community access monitors?
Yes, I would support a system of community access monitors. And I do think we ought to educate building inspectors, and we ought to work with architects and developers, but all of that's not going to be enough. It's not going to be enough. Because remember that the ADA requirements don't just apply to new construction. So the hotel at the southern end of Commercial Street, and I think I know which one you're talking about, Kim, that hotel ought to fix itself. But there's going to be an enormous amount of resistance from property owners. And I was thinking, actually, this morning, okay, if that's the case, what do? Do we go up and beat them over the head? Probably not. That's probably not going to work. One of the things we can do is we can work with the banks in Maine. And we can get the banks to make low interest, very low interest loans to owners of buildings and developers of new buildings, but really to owners of existing buildings, to make those capital investments that will bring about compliance with the ADA requirements, and to make those loans repayable upon the sale of the building, upon the sale of the property, and to pass a law in the state of Maine that restricts the transfer of commercial and industrial properties that are subject to the ADA, if those improvements haven't been made. Now, if you're a building owner who would otherwise object to doing this, that is mostly, I think, a costless or nearly costless solution. We need the cooperation of the banks. I'll need to work with the legislature. But if that's an example of the kinds of ways we can think creatively to get stuff done. And instead of being here now for, I would argue, 11 long years of not getting stuff done, let's start thinking about how we can get stuff done. That may be one way to do it.
Okay, thank you. Number 5, in view of the current economic crisis and the likelihood that Maine will be faced with even greater pressure on our state budget, are you willing to make a priority of defending crucial services and supports for people with disabilities? Do you have ideas on how best to insulate Maine citizens with disabilities from cuts in their essential services?
I think I've made it clear that providing a substantially equal opportunity is my single criterion for what I do. And I will implement that through both the kinds of decisions I make, the priorities I set. You'll see it in the budget, and you'll see it in what I do and how I behave. Everything we're talking about today, from bringing buildings into compliance with the ADA to expanding Medicaid coverage and so on, all of these are examples of the kinds of efforts we need to make to create substantially equal opportunity. And there is not anything that I have suggested or will suggest that I don't think will pay back to the state of Maine in dividends way, way, way beyond the cost of doing it. People may have to be persuaded of that. They may have to be educated a little bit. But I will do that. I'm committed to it.
Great. Number 6, do you have ideas for increasing the high school graduation rate of kids with disabilities so that they can transition to productive and fulfilling lives?
You know, I don't know what the graduation rate is exactly in Maine for young people with disabilities. The graduation rate across the population from our high school, do you know, Kim?
Well, I'm sorry.
What's the
I was
graduation rate?
listening.
You weren't listening.
I was listening. I don't know what it is right now. Does anybody else know?
Anybody know?
All kids?
Yeah.
No, all kids I know. All kids is 85%. Well, the statistic, the reported statistic is 85. So let's
So
start with
significantly
that.
lower.
All right, significantly lower. So let's start though with the 85%. We graduate about 85% of our seniors in high school. That is solid. It's not great, but it's about 10th or 12th in the country. It's not as good as it ought to be. And they're not as prepared as they ought to be. But we're graduating them. Our biggest problem is that we're 34th in the country in the percentage of our high school seniors, graduates, who go on to any post-secondary education or training. We're 34th. That's what we have to change. Now, my guess is that we're doing even worse among kids with disabilities. Of course we are.
Way worse.
Now, why is that? Well, I think one of the reasons is that we're not beginning transition work early enough in a child's life. I think we're now, at 14, we've gone from 16 to 14. Bob Hassan, who's my good friend, who is the former superintendent of the SA, whatever it is, Greeley, Cumberland and other towns, he's former superintendent, and I think a terrific guy. Bob says we ought to go down to the age of 10 or 11. And that makes sense to me simply from what I've observed in my own wife's practice. You've got to get into the kids. And we ought to be doing screening. We ought to be doing prenatal and postpartum screening. We ought to be doing screening of every child in the state of Maine for all sorts of disabilities early. And we ought to be addressing the problems early. And if we expand the coverage under Medicaid, we're going to be far better able to do that. And if we continue to hamstring ourselves and think as narrowly as we've been thinking about opportunities for people in Maine, we're not going to do it. We're going to change this. We're going to change the entire approach to creating a substantially equal opportunity for everyone in Maine.
Great.
Can I say a little bit more about this? Because
Sure.
politicians love to talk about what they want to do, about what we ought to do, about what I'm going to do, and they never tell you how we're going to pay for it. Except I do. Many of you are probably familiar with the property tax relief plan that we have proposed that will cut property taxes for every median homeowner in the state of Maine by 20 to 40%. And there are strong and important reasons for doing that. And we're going to pay for that. We're going to pay for that with an increase in the sales tax from 5.5% to 6%, or we're going to drop the sales tax back from 5.5% to 5%, except in the months of May through October, when we're going to bring it up to 7%. You know why? Bingo. There are 1,300,000 of us in the state of Maine, and we're taking care of this huge piece of real estate. 15 million people a year come to visit us, and I don't think it's unfair of us to ask them to help us a little bit take care of that property, that state, this state, our state. When we do that, we're going to raise $185 million. $100 million of it goes back to towns and cities in Maine to replace the revenue sharing they've lost, all of it and more, goes back to them. But $75 million of it goes to school districts around the state to do three things. Number one, we're going to make universal 3 to 4-year-old early childhood education available in every school district in the state of Maine. And we're going to screen those kids. Secondly, and that's going to cost about 30 million, 25 to 30 million a year, every year. Secondly, we're going to pay good teachers and other education professionals more. And we're going to provide more training and more professionalism. We're going to build the core of good teachers and education professionals in the state. And third, we're going to make, I think it's 20 to 25 million, available in high poverty school districts with high percentages of kids on free and reduced lunch, because they're not getting enough in the EPS formula. Now, it's not like going to Cape Elizabeth High School or Falmouth High School if you're living in Eastport or East Millinocket. You don't have the AP courses, you don't have all the education professionals, you don't have all the outreach. And I don't think that a kid's opportunities, here we go again, back to opportunity. I don't think that a kid's opportunities in Maine ought to be a function of the affluence of his or her parents or the zip code where he or she grows up, period.
Thank you. This really is a follow-up to that. This question is a follow-up to that. It's also about kids. Federal and state laws require that students with disabilities are educated in the least restrictive environment and that appropriate accommodations and support services are provided to them. Currently, Maine public school staff are not uniformly supported and trained to meet the needs of children with mental health disabilities. As a result, children in Maine are often placed in overly restrictive and expensive private facilities. Now, you just mentioned this, so this question is, how would you increase supports and training for public school staff to ensure that they meet the needs of children with all disabilities?
Well, I think, Kim, I just answered that. I don't know any other way to do it other than providing targeted funds, not through the EPS, but for these and other important purposes that just aren't being met right now. So can I leave it with that?
Sure.
Okay. Because I don't want to cut in on your time with Mike, because he needs time to answer his question.
Okay. Number 8, people with disabilities don't need pity and a handout. They need respect and support and economic power that comes with employment. How will you go about changing the fundamental way in which individuals with disabilities are portrayed in this state?
This goes back, I think, to something I talked about earlier.
Yeah.
It's how a governor models behavior. Right now, we've got a bad model. But I want people in Maine on a daily basis to see me working with Adam Zimmerman, the lawyer I mentioned in my introduction. I want Maine people to see me working every day with people who may have disabilities but are able to contribute important things to the state's welfare. And when people see a governor doing that every single day, it's going to begin to change their minds. Behavior models what people think, and that's what we're going to do when I'm governor.
All right, I think we have time for the one last question.
Okay?
This is a very specific question.
Yes.
In response to a 2010 complaint by the Disability Rights Center, Maine's Commissioner of Education found that the state had failed to provide a free and appropriate public education for blind children. To correct this situation, a DOE advisory panel recommended that 4 additional teaching positions be funded. Funding for 2 of these positions was added to the budget by the legislature, and 2 have been funded for the current year by DOE with one-time federal dollars. This temporary federal funding needs to be replaced with general fund dollars in the state's budget. If elected, would you support adding dollars to the biennial budget to fund these 2 positions for teachers of the blind and visually impaired?
Yes. I mean, if I've figured out how to come up with $185 million, I think I can figure out how to come up with $130,000.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you all very, very much. Appreciate it. Thank you. Oh, by the way, By the way, I'd love to have your vote on November 4th. Thank you.